Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right, folks. We're back. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, let's get right into this because we've got a lot of material to try and cover tonight. We are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the broadcast listening audience in order to keep the network operating. So, if you enjoy the information, the shows, the discussions, the revelations, and the guests and the hosts on the other shows on the network, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website and get signed up as a subscribing member. Even if it's as little as $10, $15 a month, every membership helps, and we do need your support to keep the broadcast network operating. And if you want to get more fully informed and well educated on my favorite topic on this show every Thursday evening at 6 o'clock on the Liberty Works Radio Network, you find your way over to the tax-freedom.com website and start reading, get educated, because the Supreme Court has done in the IRS and exposed that what the lower federal courts have been doing, basically since the end of World War II, is a complete and total constitutional fraud. It's all exposed at taxfreedom.com. Go over and get educated. If you know anyone that needs help answering administrative correspondence from the IRS or answering the DOJ in court over taxation, income tax, send them over to irszoom.com, where you can get help answering IRS correspondence letters and responding to the DOJ in court over tax issues, both civil and criminal. Okay, so we had the State of the Union Tuesday night, and Trump's speech was excellent, and the Democrats, what can you say? The Democrats have just gone stupid. Absolutely stupid. Trump, put them to it, put the fire to it. He queried of them, if you believe your first duty as a member of Congress is to represent and secure the safety of the American people, stand up. And he said, the American people, instead of illegal aliens, stand up. Every single Republican stood up instantly. I think the only Democrat that stood up was John Fetterman. I'm not sure if any of them stood up. I know he stood up for a couple of them, but he was the only Democrat. The Democrats apparently do not stand for America anymore. What they stand for is the global village, the one world government, the new world order that will allow the aristocracy of the governing politburos, parliaments, and Congress to not just rule their own country, but together rule the world. That's what the Democrats stand for, ruling you. They will not stand to represent you because it interferes with their ruling you. They're not happy being representatives. They want to tell you what to think, what to do, what you're allowed to do, what to have, how you're allowed to move, where you're allowed to go, what fuel you'll use, how much you'll pay for food, for energy, for vacation, for your life. They don't stand for America anymore. They stand for the New World Order, the global agenda that puts the World Economic Council, the World Health Organization, and the Federal Reserve banks and their banking cartel globally in charge of you, ruling you, treating you like slaves and peons by forcing you to service the ungodly and unconstitutional debt being run up by every single government on the planet running this fractional reserve crime system of robbery and enslavement that gives a monopoly on currency and credit to the elite bankers and their party allies in the government and CEOs of the corporations all over the planet, gives them complete control of the world by giving them access to capital that nobody else has access to. So, of course, what develops is what they want, not what you need. Because the entire tax and money system is designed to enslave you, not represent you or serve you. It's designed to steal from you by direct taxation and gradual inflation the power, the economic, the political power of your paycheck. Because that's where all the power is, both economically and politically. Money talks. BS walks. And that's exactly how the politicians are treating us, aren't they? They take the money from the corporations, write laws that serve the corporations, and your BS walks. Because the car ran out of electricity and there's no gas stations. Yeah, right. All the car companies are shutting down their EV divisions because nobody's buying. It was a total fraud by the Democrats to push that nonsense and drive the price of gasoline up to what? $9 in California, $5 all over the country, which is one of the things Trump, of course, focused on in his State of the Union address, not only pointing out that the Democrats don't stand for or represent America, that they're fundamentally incapable of standing up for America now, because they don't stand for you. They don't represent you. They represent the big money, the billionaires, the corporations, the foreign governments, and the unlimited open borders and immigration. That's what they represent. Importing dirt poor, uneducated, welfare-dependent, illegal aliens to become new Democrat voters who vote for welfare in the blue states, while retaining and actually giving congressional representation and electoral college votes to illegal aliens, meaning foreigners are getting representation in the American government. Now, this was never, ever, ever anticipated by the Founding Fathers when they said, take a census, count everyone, and then give representation proportionate to the results. It was never envisioned that there would be 50 million illegal aliens polluting the count and giving far more representation to foreigners in states like California, Illinois, New York, Maryland, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, where they're enrolling the illegal aliens to vote in the state elections. A surprise! They end up voting in the federal elections because the state runs the federal election in the states. So since they can vote in state elections, they're registered to vote in the federal election too. And they do, and they are. And the Democrats know it, and they're stealing representation from the American people because they don't want to stand for you. They want to stand for themselves, their own power, their own wealth, and global control over everyone. Not just control over America. So that's what the Democrats stand for now. And it's just disgusting. It's just disgusting. Trump went through the state of America, comparing this new golden age of an all-time stock market high, so a couple of weeks ago of 50,000, and using the gold medals won by the hockey team. And the Democrats got upset about that. Oh, it's only the men. So Trump said he would bring the women to the White House and made a joke, and now the media's all upset about that. They're not concerned about the golden age of America being represented by both the men's and the women's hockey teams winning the gold medal against Canada. Men's hockey gold medal, first time in 46 years since the Miracle on Ice in 1980. And of course, before that, it was 1960. So 20 years to the second and 46 years to the third gold medal. Canada's been pretty dominant, but no, the Democrats couldn't celebrate that. They were upset They were upset about the golden age of America, where inflation for the last quarter has been driven down to 1.7%. It's back to where it was when Trump left office in 2020. 1.6% was the number when he left office. Biden immediately drove it to 9% within 2 years with his insane energy policies, which I told you at the time would do that because energy is a cost component in every single product on the market. You artificially raise the price of energy and you drive inflation through the roof, not because of the currency printing, but because of the price of energy, which works just like inflation. When energy goes up, everything goes up, and it feels like inflation. It's really bad energy policy, which is why Trump has been able to recover so quickly and bring it down to 1.7 in just 1 year. Because if it were inflation, he couldn't do that. But it's not real inflation. It was bad energy policy the whole time. And having fixed the bad energy policy by drill baby drill, taking out the regulations that prevented gas and now adding some 70 million barrels of oil from Venezuela to production in Texas and more to come, no doubt, are driving down the price of oil all over the planet. And although it's recently had a spike back up a bit because of the tensions arriving in Iran, it will settle down as that Venezuelan oil begins to get processed and released by America. And as, who was it that just announced they were gonna, Saudi Arabia just announced that they're going to stop using their own oil. They're gonna sell all the oil they have. And what are they going to use? They're going to import natural gas from America and convert all their systems to natural gas so they can sell the oil that they have. And that way they can be cleaner and wealthier at the same time. So inflation's down, energy is down. In Oklahoma, it's down below $2 a gallon. Across the nation, it's less than $3. And as energy comes down, so does everything else. Food prices are down and are stabilizing and have recovered. Investments, well, Trump secured some $18 trillion in infrastructure investment promises from the major corporations to develop energy plants and AI capabilities. Crime is down, the murder rates are down. Washington, D.C. is actually safe to go out in for the first time in 5 years. Illegal aliens are being deported by the hundreds of thousands, and that, of course, impacts crime, and the cartels are under assault, being arrested and removed. The border is closed. And this time it's really closed, not just fake closed. Let's hope they're on top of finishing the wall and getting that Keystone pipeline constructed and finished so the Democrats can't interfere with oil production the next time they get in power. Which may be never, the way the idiots can't stand up and want to vote for girls being wiped out by boys in their own sports and raped in their own bathrooms by psychologically mentally ill individuals, which of course is what's really going on. They want to normalize mental illness because the Democrat Party is basically mentally ill. They've adopted all the most far extreme left mentally ill positions that could be dreamed up. And there are a number of Democrats pointing it out. People like Bill Maher, who used to be as far left as you can be, has actually come back to the center and is calling out the Democrats for their insanity. And of course, it's now been disclosed that the FBI, in addition to spying on 8 senators, spied on Kash Patel and Susie Wiles. Kash Patel, of course, is now the FBI director, and Susie Wiles is the White House counsel. So Jack Smith went on a fishing trip, violated every rule in the book and the rights of every single person he went after. That man should be in prison. All of that crap was nonsense. Okay, I hear the first commercial break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour. Get on over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website. Get signed up as a subscribing member. Okay, this is Thomas Fried on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour. Let's just get right back into this. When a commercial break came up, I was just finishing up with the first segment on current events, which I think we covered everything. Yeah, let's just move on. Okay, for the last few weeks, I've been reading from the petition we're submitting to the Supreme Court to try and expose and utilize what the Supreme Court wrote in Moore concerning constitutional taxation, specifically the federal personal income tax, which the court has taken apart. So why don't we go ahead and get right back into that. And I was up to issue 7, but you know what? Let's go back and review the first 6 issues because we're building this case step by step to make sure that the courts, anybody who reads it, understands what's happened. So the issues that we've gone through were issue 1. In Moore et Ux v. United States, 602 U.S. 572, 2024, this Supreme Court held that the federal personal income tax is an indirect tax under authority of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution. Issue 2. In Moore, the court held that all direct taxes must be apportioned to the several states for payment in proportion to the last census as required under the Constitution by Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, and Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4. Turns out the 16th Amendment did not do away with the requirement that all direct taxes be apportioned. Issue 3, the federal personal income tax is not a non-apportioned direct tax on income under the 16th Amendment, which is, of course, what the lower courts have been telling you since 1955. It's a direct non-apportioned tax under the 16th Amendment. That was a lie. The Supreme Court has exposed the lie. And now it's time for the American people to wake up. Issue 4, the case record shows the district court erroneously claimed a subject matter jurisdiction under the 16th Amendment to enforce a non-apportioned direct tax on income against the individual person of the defendant. It claimed it was a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. Under the Constitution and Issue 5, under the Constitution and Moore, the federal courts lack the subject matter jurisdiction to conduct tax trials of individuals to enforce against them the payment of a non-apportioned direct tax on their own income under an alleged authority of the 16th Amendment to tax directly and without limitation. It's a fraud. There is no direct tax, and any court claiming the income tax is a non-apportioned direct tax lacks the subject matter jurisdiction to enforce that claim. It's been a criminal constitutional fraud by the judges for 75 years. The judges are defrauding you of your own heritage, your own property, your own freedom, your own sovereignty, your own nation, your constitution, and the rights secured by them, granted not by the government, but by God. And the government wants them removed so that it can play God in your life and rule you as a physical body, instead of representing your true nature, which is dual, that of both the physical body and a spiritual soul. Issue 6, the Circuit Court erred in its judgment by stating, since ratification of the 16th Amendment, whether an income tax is a direct tax or indirect tax is immaterial. It further erred in asserting that it is beyond dispute that Congress has the power to tax the income of individuals, as Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 does not authorize any such direct and unavoidable taxation of the citizens in the 50 states. So everything the courts have saying for 50 years is an error. It does matter if the 16th Amendment is involved with direct or indirect, because direct taxes can only be collected from the states. They must be apportioned. And indirect taxes have to be uniform on the citizens, and the personal income tax is neither. It's enforced as an unlimited direct tax. You owe, and unavoidably you owe tax. You work, and unavoidably you owe tax. It's supposed to be indirect, based on only certain things. And since direct taxes have to be apportioned to the states, it certainly matters whether the tax is deemed direct or indirect by the courts. And of course, ruling that Article 1, Section 8 has been used to tax the income of individuals, that's the error that's been perpetrated for 75 years. A direct tax allowing the direct taxation of individuals. So they're just reasserting the error and not even bothering or trying to reconcile the past rulings with the new ruling by the Supreme Court in Moore et al. in 2024. So that takes us to issue 7. Let's drop down here, pick it up with issue 7. Issue 7, here we go. Back to the brief after reviewing the 6 points we're up to. Issue 7, no admissible prima facie evidence of tax under IRC 6201, 6020B, and 6020B2 that was good and sufficient in court for all legal purposes was presented at trial sufficient to support a conviction of the defendant under Section 7201. They never produced any prima facie evidence, which is required under the statutes to be a subscribed, signed tax return. Okay, let's read the argument. The trial record in the district court is clear. At trial, the plaintiff appellee, United States, catastrophically failed to introduce any evidence of any kind that showed that any statutory liability for tax existed in the defendant's name, or even that any lawful tax applied to the defendant's earnings and was thus owed. Finally, no evidence of a legal assessment of tax under IRC Section 6201, 6020B, and 6020B2 was ever introduced or placed on the record at trial. Now, y'all should listen to this because this is how the government conducts every single one of its tax trials. They never produce the evidence. They allow it to be assumed because it's not properly challenged at introduction. And this is what happens. Instead of producing at trial any legitimate evidence of tax, or of tax being owed by any lawful assessment, or even of a statutory liability for the court to enforce. Jump, where am I? What happened here? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. At trial, they catastrophically failed to introduce any evidence of any kind that showed that any statutory liability for tax existed in the defendant's name, or even that any lawful tax applied to the defendant's earnings. I'm repeating. That any lawful tax applied to Cromar's earnings and was thus owed. Finally, no evidence of a legal assessment of tax under IRC Section 6201, 6020B, 6020B2 was ever introduced or placed on the record at trial. Instead of producing at trial any legitimate evidence of tax or of tax being owed by lawful assessment, or even of a statutory liability for the court to enforce, the plaintiff chose to introduce evidence that only showed the defendant earned money from sources within America. But there was no evidence in the trial record of any tax imposed on those sources, nor of any statutory liability for tax in the defendant's name, because the tax and liability elements were erroneously assumed to exist by the plaintiff, the court, and the jury through the wrongfully believed existence of a non-apportioned direct tax on the income of all persons under alleged authority of the 16th Amendment, which is not true. And there's a quote. If any question of fact or liability be conclusively presumed against him, this is not due process of law. Black's Law Dictionary, 500, 6th edition, 1990, according to U.S. Department of Agriculture v. Murray, 1973, and Stanley v. Illinois, 1972. You cannot assume liability. It's a violation of due process. And the statutorily unauthorized substitution of the Form 4549 examination worksheets at trial as alleged evidence of tax assessed, the substitution for the statutorily required prima facie evidence of a subscribed tax return sworn under jurat were not admissible at trial as prima facie or the best evidence of tax owed under 6201, 6020b2. So the Form 4549 examination worksheets they substitute for tax returns are not statutorily considered to be prima facie evidence of an assessment. They're not admissible as evidence in court. They're getting away with substituting non-statutory evidence for statutorily required evidence that doesn't exist. IR Revenue Ruling 2005-59 and the decision of the Supreme Court taken in Beard v. Commissioner, 6th Circuit, 1986, where the court held, in general, a document filed with the service is treated as a return if the document, 1, contains sufficient data to calculate the tax liability, 2, purports to be a return, 3, represents an honest and reasonable attempt to satisfy the requirements of the tax law, and 4, is executed under penalties of perjury. Beard v. Commissioner, citing Badaracco v. Commissioner, Zellerbach Paper Company v. Helverine, and Florsham Brother Dry Goods v. United States, 1930. The Beard decision simply reflects what the statute requires, which requirements were not satisfied by the IRS auditor's mere testimony of amounts earned by the defendant in America. There is a statutory requirement for a subscribed and sworn tax return to exist under the statute. And then we cite the statute, 6020B, 6020, returns prepared for or executed by secretary. B, execution of return by secretary. 1, authority of secretary to execute return. If any person fails to make any return, the secretary shall make such return from his own knowledge and from such information as he can obtain through testimony or otherwise. 2, status of returns. Any return so made and subscribed by the secretary or her delegate shall be prima facie good and sufficient for all legal purposes. The statute requires a signature on a subscribed return, and the examination worksheets have been deemed by legal proceedings not to be tax returns. So how do they get substituted as evidence of an assessment when they're not tax returns required to exist in order to be prima facie good and sufficient for all legal purposes? The statute's quite clear. This is an evidentiary standard in statute. Prima facie good and sufficient only if it's a subscribed tax return making the assessment, which of course goes to 6201, that says the IRS can assess taxes that are unpaid taxes payable by stamp, and taxes shown on a return. So without a return, they can't make the assessment. Therefore, without any prima facie evidence under IRC 6020b2 of a subscribed tax return assessing the tax, how is it possible to charge a defendant under Section 7201 of failing to pay or evading or defeating a tax that is not factually evidenced as being owed? IRC Section 6020b2 plainly provides that if a required tax return is not filed, then the secretary may prepare that return. And upon being subscribed, that tax return becomes the only evidence under the statute that shall be prima facie good and sufficient for all legal purposes, i.e., as the admissible best evidence of an assessment of tax under 6201, 6020b2. Okay. I think I hear the second commercial break coming up, so we'll pick up continuing with this issue 7 when we get back here. The point is, this is how IRS and DOJ conduct all their tax trials. They lie to the court, they lie to the jury, and substitute examination worksheets for tax returns. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. I'm just going to get right back into reading this petition to the Supreme Court to end the federal, or rather, end the maladministration of the federal personal income tax by the IRS, the DOJ, and the lower federal courts. Let's just get right into it. The Circuit Court writes, in this case, the government's proof consisted of an IRS audit of the defendant's finances. The auditor gave meticulous testimony about the audit process, including his collection of bank records and other financial information and his interview with the defendant. So, it was only proved at trial that the defendant earned money in Utah, and not that any tax applied to his earnings or was owed by him by the proper introduction of prima facie evidence of a legal assessment made on a subscribed tax return that was sworn under jurat. Neither the tax nor its alleged assessment was properly evidenced at trial, which is bereft of any such evidence, the record, but rather was improperly allowed to be assumed by the jury without the prima facie best evidence required by statute of a subscribed tax return being present and introduced in the record as evidence. The court further writes, the auditor explained how he used that information to calculate Cromar's deficiency amounts, the defendant's deficiency amounts, for each tax period at issue, R volume 4 at 360. The auditor explained that his certification ultimately became a substitute for return, which the IRS creates when the taxpayer fails to file a tax return, ID at 378. Except they never created one. That's a lie. This evidence was sufficient for a reasonable juror to find that Cromar owed a substantial tax liability, and that's a lie. Showing that someone earned money is not sufficient to establish that there's a statutory liability in their name for the payment of any tax. That's a completely different element. So the auditor again admitted that the alleged deficiency was only based on the defendant's earning money in Utah and was not based on a subscribed tax return. Nor was it based on any identified indirect federal tax that applied to Cromar's activities or transactions, as the Supreme Court held in Moore. But that is not the legal process required by statute. To have the prima facie best evidence of tax assessed and owed under Section 6201, 6020B, and 6020B2, which provide that without a subscribed tax return, there is no prima facie evidence that is admissible in court as the best evidence of tax owed. There is no provision in the statutes for an auditor to explain that his certification becomes a substitute for return without a subscribed tax return ever being signed, sworn to, or executed as required by the statute. They're making up their own rules. This is where Chevron comes in, to make up liability through the bureaucrat's interpretation. It's not in the statute. They just make it up. They assume it because you earned money. But they never do a return. I've explained before, it's because the Form 1040 isn't required and it isn't authorized. So they just lie to the computer. Let's go on. Additionally, the lower courts both erroneously proclaimed that there is no requirement to file a tax return in order to be guilty of attempting to evade and defeat tax under Section 7201. Circuit Court Order and Judgment, page 9. This is another erroneous holding because without the false assumption of a direct tax under the 16th Amendment, and without a sworn, subscribed tax return as required by law under Section 6020B2, there is no admissible evidence of tax owed by the defendant for him to be guilty of attempting to evade and or defeat. How are you guilty of evading or failing to pay something that's never been demonstrated as being owed by the required best evidence as a subscribed tax return? They just made it up. Everything in the court for 75 years has been a judicial fantasy, a liberal communist fantasy. Communist because they're enforcing the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, not legitimate indirect taxation of income under the Constitution. Let's keep going. The Circuit Court further writes on page 9 of the Order and Judgment, and this court has acknowledged that the government's evidence in tax evasion cases typically is circumstantial, precisely because direct proof is often unavailable. Are you kidding me? United States v. Thompson, 10th Circuit, 2008. Are you kidding me? Circumstantial? It's not statutory. It's not based in law. It's Are you kidding me? They're admitting how fraudulent it's been. They're admitting it. Statutorily required evidence that is only prima facie when subscribed under a sworn jurat can neither be circumstantial nor assumed without introduction at trial. This is true because there is no tax under the Constitution that can be assumed to apply to the earnings of an American citizen that he, she must pay themselves, simply because of the circumstance that the person earned money in America. It's all based on the erroneous and unconstitutional assumption that there's a direct tax on everything you do under the 16th Amendment, which is a constitutional fraud. The plaintiff, United States, failed at trial to show that the statutorily required prima facie and best evidence of a formal assessment of tax had ever been made on a subscribed and sworn tax return. Nor did they show that some activity and or transactions of the defendant occurred that were subject to the payment of an applicable indirect impost, duty, or excise tax. Thus, there was no admissible prima facie best evidence of any tax owed that was good and sufficient for all legal purposes in court as evidence of assessed tax owed by the defendant, sufficient for him to have been found guilty under Count 1, Section 7201. The plaintiff, United States, failed at trial to produce any prima facie admissible best evidence of a lawful assessment of tax made on a subscribed tax return form 1040 or 1040 variant for any tax year that could lawfully be considered by the jury as the required prima facie best evidence of tax owed that was good and sufficient for all legal purposes as evidence, because the plaintiff failed at trial to enter into any evidence, any subscribed tax return forms that had been prepared and subscribed under a sworn jurat under penalty of perjury, under Section 6020B, 6020B2, 6065, and Beard Supra. No evidence of tax owed was ever presented. The entire trial, all I did was show he made money. No evidence of tax, no evidence of liability. You made money, you owe. It's as unconstitutional and communistic as it gets. And they've been doing it for 75 years, basically since the end of World War II, 1955. And the Glenshaw Glass Commission. Okay, let's keep going. Furthermore, there was no evidence introduced at trial of any indirect tax that was applied or was owed by the defendant as an impost, duty, or excise that was shown by evidence to be imposed on the defendant's earnings, sources of earnings, activities, and or transactions that were conducted in America by him in the subject tax years. No evidence of any tax, no evidence of any taxable activity subject to impost, duty, or excise, only that he made money. That's all the evidence. But that's not a valid basis for indirect taxation by impost, duty, and excise, which only taxes foreign persons and foreign places, imports, exports, commodities, licenses, and corporations. There's no taxation of your right to work under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, by impost, duty, or excise. That's why they've had to lie to you and tell you it was the 16th Amendment. You can't get there under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. It doesn't exist. There's no tax on the labor of the American people conducted by right. You're not the corporate person that earns everything through the privilege of incorporation, which makes everything the corporate person earns taxable. The citizen earns by right, not taxable privilege. There's a fundamental difference. But without the foundational evidence of some real tax that applied to the evidenced earnings, it is legally impossible to find the defendant guilty of attempting to evade or defeat a tax that has not been shown by proper evidence or law to either constitutionally exist or to apply to the defendant's earnings, regardless of the irrelevant and distracting circumstantial evidence that he earned money in America. Under Moore, the Supreme Court's decision in 2024, earning money is not a valid constitutional basis for the indirect taxation of income, circumstantially or otherwise. Without evidence of some applicable indirect taxing power, there can be no evading or defeating of any tax, because no assessment of tax was ever made under law on a subscribed and sworn tax return, thereby establishing the specific and exact amount of liability for tax to be enforced civilly or criminally. Issue 8. Okay, in Issue 8 we get into how Chevron and regulatory deference have been misused by the lower courts for some 50 years now to manufacture a direct liability out of regulation when there is none in the statute. They made it up, just like they made up the direct tax, just like they made up the power to tax directly and without limitation under the 16th Amendment. It's all made up. And since there is no power granted, there is no tax imposed, and there is no liability in the statute, they had to make that up too in the regulation. And Chevron allowed the bureaucracy to write its own law, making you allegedly directly liable, even though the liability isn't specified in the statute. They made it up in the regulations for Section 1, tax imposed, thereby creating the ability to enforce a direct tax based on that imaginary liability made up by the bureaucrats in writing their own regulations to enforce the communistic version that empowers them as the bureaucracy and strips you of your freedom, your liberty, your purse, your economics, your wallet, your prosperity, your ability to save, because that 30% they steal is what you had the chance to save if they didn't steal it, but they stole it. So they spent it and you have nothing. The whole thing is a complete and total constitutional fraud, and we're going to pick this up next week because I can see here we're running out of time. Now, next week we'll be talking about Chevron and regulatory deference and how it has perverted and corrupted the income tax enforcement system at both the IRS, DOJ, and judicial levels. Okay, I think I hear that final commercial break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. I do urge you to find your way over to our website, get signed up, find your way over to Tax Freedom, get educated. I'll be back next week with more on more.